Well, welcome everyone. So we're happy to be back at Mount Druitt once again, which is of course the home of Aletheia Apologetics Group. And hopefully we're trying to have a couple of meetings a year here. This, I believe, is our very first formal debate. So we've had panels in the past and discussions, panel discussions, but this is the first time we're actually having a formal debate. Interestingly, the participants have kind of agreed to make it a fairly informal, formal debate. So what we're going to be doing today is, after I give a very brief introduction, we'll be hearing a 10-minute presentation first from the party to my left, who I'll introduce shortly, and then followed by a 10-minute presentation from the party to my right, followed by about half an hour of letting them argue with each other. And then for the last hour of the night, we're going to open the floor for questions and discussion from the audience. So please do be thinking about questions to ask. We'll be using that microphone just to your left at the front of the church if you'd like to ask a question, but I'll say more about that when we get a little bit closer. So the topic that we're discussing today is whether atheism or theism is the default position. Often in discussions about the existence of God, we find that there's a basic question that needs to be answered before we can get on to the really, chunky stuff. The question of, should we begin by assuming that there is no God, and therefore the burden of proof is to show that there is a God? Or should we begin by assuming that there is a God, and therefore the burden of proof is to then show that there isn't, that that's a mistaken assumption? It's important because until you get past that, or until you at least agree on that with the person you're talking to, you may be working on very different assumptions. Of course, the person who has the burden of proof has the more work to do. If they fail in making their case, then the other person gets to be right without saying a thing, right? You could win an argument by saying nothing, depending on the assumption that you start with at the beginning. So this is kind of maybe something we should have done 6 years ago, to start with this question and ask, who has the burden of proof? On who has to make the case? Do you start by saying that there is no God, show me that there is, or do you start by saying, obviously there's a God, show me that there isn't? To help us to work our way through this question today, we have, starting on my far left, Blake Regan, who is a physicist, and he participates in the UTS Atheist Society. We'd like to welcome Blake in the normal way. Next to him is Thomas Cox, who is the president of the Macquarie University Atheist Society, and we welcome him. Blake and Thomas, of course, will be putting the case that we should begin by assuming that God exists. No, I'm just joking. I don't know what they're going to say yet. We're going to find out in a few minutes. On my right-hand side, we have two members of the Aletheia Apologetics team. We have Meena Mikhael, who's a scientist at Western Sydney University, and we're very happy to have Meena with us today for one particular reason, and that is his wife is just short of 9 months pregnant, and we weren't quite sure if he was going to be with us tonight or at the hospital. And thankfully, Christine was very, very kind and decided to hold off on having the baby so that he could be with us tonight. So we welcome Meena today. And yes, Christine, if you're watching, thank you so much. We really do appreciate it. And last but not least is Abraam Phillips, who is also from the Aletheia group, as we mentioned, and is a doctor at one of our luxurious and well-appointed public hospitals. Thank you very much, Abraam. So, without further ado, I will hand over to Thomas, I believe.
Hello, everyone. I'm Thomas. I'll be arguing that atheism is the default position. I just wanted to start by saying thanks to you guys, the apologetics group, the church, and everyone for inviting us to an event. It's very gracious. Thank you for the opportunity. I also want to thank you, the audience. I think it's important, no matter your beliefs, to listen to the other side and to be critical in your search for the truth. It's not always easy, and you guys should be commended for challenging yourselves. What I want to talk about is how we know things. This debate is all about who has the burden of proof and what assumptions we should start with, and at the root of that is epistemology, the ways we search for the truth and where we start. First, let me give you a bit of history about me. I grew up in a mildly religious household at best. My parents did consider religion in high holding though, so I did go to an Anglican high school, I went to Christian youth group, I was christened. Just like most children, I grew up with beliefs in Santa and the Tooth Fairy, but even as a child I was very skeptical. One time I lost a tooth and kept it in my mouth for 3 days, putting it under my pillow at nighttime. And it was only on the third night, just a few hours after I told my sister that the tooth disappeared and there was money under my pillow. And I learned 2 things that day, and that was not to trust everything I was told by my parents and not to tell my sister secrets. Now, keep that image of the little skeptical kid in your mind and fast forward to my Anglican high school years with my many Christian friends, and I'm sure you can imagine the arguments I got into with some of them about their various religious claims. I remember one particular argument with my religious friend James about whether people really could live to 700 years old, as the Bible claims. Well, I couldn't prove he was wrong, but similarly, he couldn't prove he was right. He believed that people could live that old, and I believed they couldn't. So how do we determine who was correct? Well, the truth of it is we can't, not conclusively. There's very little we can be truly certain of. I think, therefore I am, squares have 4 sides, 1 + 1 is 2, but that's about it. So let's get the idea of absolute knowledge out of the way and talk about beliefs. There are a few types of beliefs I want to talk about, true beliefs and false beliefs, and justified beliefs and unjustified beliefs. True and false beliefs are fairly straightforward. If the belief is in fact true, it's a true belief. If it's like my belief in Santa was, then it's a false belief. I know I say that straightforward, but as we discussed, there's very little that you can actually know for certain, so we often can't tell if our beliefs are true or not. And that's where justified belief comes in. Justified beliefs are beliefs that are reasonable given what information you have. My belief in Santa as an adult is unjustified. I now know that reindeers don't fly, the world is too big for one man to visit every house, and most importantly, I know it's a myth perpetuated by parents. But as a child, my belief might have been reasonable. I had evidence that every Christmas presents were delivered and that cookies were eaten and sometimes reindeers would even leave tracks, and I had an authority telling me that my belief was justified, that my parents, of course, telling me that Santa did exist. So it's possible to have a justified false belief, and it's also possible to have an unjustified true belief, that is, a belief that you believe for bad reasons, which just happens to be true. But holding justified beliefs is the best that we can do, the closest we can get. Holding justified beliefs gives us the most accurate understanding of reality, and given more and more information, our beliefs adjust and become more and more justified, and we become closer and closer to the truth. So how do we justify our beliefs? Well, I've learned a few things over the years. I've learned I can't trust my own senses. I once woke up with a feeling as if I was being choked, a shadowy figure standing over me. Based on my senses alone, it might have seemed justified to assume that that was happening as I saw it, but as I said, I've learned better. This is a phenomenon called sleep paralysis. That's where your brain wakes up, but your body is still chemically paralyzed. Your brain makes up reasons for why you can't breathe and why you can't move. And mine hallucinated a shadowy figure. A lot of people see a monster sitting on their chest. That's why sleep paralysis is also sometimes called old hag syndrome. If there were someone else in that room or an instrument, like a camera or something, the story would have contradicted mine. And maybe if I was more skeptical, I would have looked into natural explanations and wouldn't have spent years looking for reasons why what I saw was real. While it may have been justified back then, it's not justified now as an adult that understands my eyes and mind can be deceived by illusions and hallucinations and such. We need non-biased confirmation of our belief. Science does this by experimenting and objectively measuring phenomena and testing their beliefs critically. And everyone can put their claims to their test. And I encourage you to do so, because through good testing, the truth will always show itself. That's a key thing about justified beliefs. It's not just enough to have some evidence. You need to also look at all the evidence available to you, test your beliefs, and change them in the face of new facts. If you're just accepting and not testing, you're not searching for the truth, you're hiding from it. And that's why I'm an atheist. Throughout all my testing, I haven't found a good reason to believe there is a God. Now, neither me or Blake would tell you there isn't a God. We're open to the idea, we just remain unconvinced. And I'm sure everyone here knows how it feels to be unconvinced, because I presume none of you are Buddhists, Muslims, Scientologists, Hindus. Everyone has started without a belief and remained unconvinced of something. Everyone has dismissed a claim. And that's what happens when we're presented with new claims. We're either convinced or unconvinced. But before that information is presented, we start in a position of disbelief. And that's what atheism is. In the Latin, it's a non-theist believer in God, a non-believer. And I think that's the default for everyone. And I don't just mean that people are born not believing. What I mean is that philosophically, people take the position and should take the position with new claims that they don't believe them unless they have evidence for believing they're true. With God, I've heard people say that they believe because they've seen miracles, they've felt a connection with Christ, that the laws of the universe and logic necessitated God, or that the beauty of the earth shows signs of creation. And now, whether those are true or not, all of those are examples of evidence and people shifting because of the evidence. It is this supposed evidence that shifted them from non-belief to belief. A lot of people get convinced at a young age, or they shift almost immediately because the evidence seems to resonate with them, but nonetheless it's still shifting because of evidence. But if you take away all the information regarding that belief, you're left in a position, the default position, non-belief, the same position I remain in, unconvinced, not believing. Now, some of you might say, that isn't that the same as being convinced God doesn't exist, because, I mean, he either exists or he doesn't, right? So if I'm saying I don't believe he exists, I must be saying he doesn't, right? But not exactly, because if you take, for example, Bigfoot. Now, I don't believe in Bigfoot, and I imagine many of you in the audience don't. But for those of you like me, I don't think you would say, I believe there's no chance that Bigfoot exists. You're merely unconvinced. You're not making a claim. You're just rejecting it. And that may seem like an insignificant distinction, but it's really not. In court, we say that someone is innocent before being proven guilty. We presume the claim false until there's evidence for the claim. The burden is on the one making the claim. And when their evidence is insufficient in court, we don't find the defendant innocent, we find them not guilty, because to call them innocent would again be a claim that needs proving. So just because we reject one claim, it doesn't mean we're necessarily convinced of the opposite. If we take the position that the default should be to accept claims, then we would assume guilt, and we'd have to prove the defendant innocent. Is that reasonable? Worse than that, with things like Bigfoot, we'd have to provide evidence he didn't exist. What does that evidence even look like? Surely if it's true, it's easier to prove guilt than innocent. Easier to prove Bigfoot than prove not Bigfoot. How do you prove not Bigfoot? Is it even possible? Should we be saying that because something cannot be disproven, it must be true? Bertrand Russell asked a similar thing and proposed Russell's teapot, a teapot that orbits around space. And he asked whether it was his responsibility to prove the teapot did exist, or the responsibility of those who are not convinced to disprove it. Of course, I would say it's unreasonable to ask those who disagree with Russell to prove the teapot didn't exist. You could photograph all the space from every angle, and yet the teapot would still Perhaps you could argue be hidden behind a rock, camouflage, or be invisible, unlike normal teapots. A similar thing happened with the Loch Ness Monster, where they sonared the whole lake and they found nothing big enough to be Nessie, and yet people still believe she could be hiding. With God, I would argue it's an order of magnitude more unreasonable to ask us to disprove God, because at least with lake monsters and teapots, we have ways of detecting them, but no ways of detecting gods. That's why I believe that we should be looking for, that's why I believe atheism is the default position. Just like the argument with my friend, Bigfoot, Russell's teapot, and every other argument, the default is to not believe the claim, and the person required to provide the evidence is the one making the claim, the one with the burden of proof, not the ones rejecting it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll be getting my telescope out and looking for that teapot later tonight. I certainly will. And now for the opposing point of view, we move over to Abraam.
Good evening, everyone. I just also want to reiterate what our wonderful guests were saying as well today about how it's a pleasure that everyone's here today and everyone's open to these ideas. We always at Aletheia reinforce the idea of everyone challenging their views and making it a habit to be critically inclined and critically thinking in terms of always challenging their views and trying to improve and harness the intellectual skills. And I also want to say thank you to Blake and Thomas for coming today. Your input is always going to be very interesting tonight. It's going to be just from hearing what Thomas was saying tonight, it's going to be a very stimulating discussion. I just wanted to go ahead and make the opposite case, which is basically that atheism is not the default position. And I think that me and Thomas agree on a lot of things. We just have a little bit of difference in terms of how we define things. Where's the computer? Sorry. Yep, it's on now. Can I just tell you to hit the button? Okay, so we'll just... Alrighty, so the first question tonight is why is this question important? And I think Abuna did a reasonable job of summarising that earlier on, so we won't spend too much time on this point. But I'd just like to highlight that last bullet point there about how people might have many different reasons for believing things, and Thomas mentioned a few different reasons as well about how we believe things because they're mathematically or scientifically brought to us, or believe things because of their perceptual, like we see, hear, touch things. So people have many different reasons why they believe things, and this all influences how people assess this question of whether or not God exists. So I'll just skip through. Actually, this is an important point to bring up. While tonight we're arguing about what is the default position, the question arises about whether or not there can be a position that's neutral in terms of where we start off with. And a lot of people that, while they might have different views about reality and so forth, or while people have different views about God's existence, for example, people might have vastly different views about what they consider to be part of the universe. For example, you can have people who are atheists who believe in spirits and all these sorts of things, or you can have people that are firmly believe in the existence of God and deny many, many things in, say, for example, the ideas of devils and so forth. So basically, you have to kind of understand that people are raised in a culture that's specific to them. People are raised in certain aspects of their life, and everyone comes to this question already with presuppositions and already beliefs that they've already formed throughout the course of their life. So it's important to try to find a rigorous way to attack this question without letting too much of those presuppositions that are not justified get in the way. And basically, my argument today is basically that views that make a positive claim to knowledge bear a burden of proof to justify that claim. This is the contention that I think we're going to spend most of the time on tonight, that both atheism and theism make positive claims to knowledge, and therefore both atheism and theism have a burden of proof to justify that claim. Now, given that both views have kind of a lot of work to do to establish that claim, that goes against the idea of atheism being the default position. And so the answer to the question, is atheism the default position, really comes down to the definition of what do you mean by atheism. Now, traditionally, the philosophical definition of atheism is the view that there is no God. Or atheism means the negation of theism, the denial of the existence of God. So basically, in traditional understanding in the world of philosophy, atheists were people that said there is no God, and they gave reasons why. For example, the idea of God doesn't make sense, or because there's too much evil and suffering in the world, or there's too many different ideas of God, so they must all be wrong. So they'll be making a claim that there is no God and giving evidence and reasons for that claim. As you notice, the way that Thomas identified or defined the word atheism, it's quite peculiar, and it's a little bit different to the traditional understanding. What he said is that it's a lack of belief in God, or a disbelief in God. And in that kind of sense, he's talking about someone who's not a theist, and that's all he's saying atheism is. Atheism is basically not theism. It's not saying there is God, or it's not saying there isn't God. It's just saying that we don't believe in something until there's evidence for that. And so basically, there's a number of problems with these with this sort of definition. Number one, it's just not the standard definition. The second, the problem is with this definition, there's too many subcategories of this definition for it to be a useful definition in dialogue. You can still say you're an atheist according to Thomas's definition and not have any idea about what that person believes about the existence of God. So, for example, all of these different categories of these people here would be classified as non-theists. So then I would have to further ask Thomas, then which category of these things does he identify as? For example, there's the weak agnosticism, which in my perspective should be the default position, which is we don't know if the proposition God exists is true or not until we assess the evidence for and against. So we should start off by saying we don't know if X exists or not, but we shouldn't automatically rule out X's existence before assessing the evidence, and we shouldn't automatically rule it in. The second type of position that's listed there is something called strong agnosticism, which is basically saying that it's not even possible to know that whether God exists or not. Now that's a different claim, and that's saying that human beings, it might be due to their limitations or so forth, can never understand why if God exists or not. And that itself requires a lot of justification to prove, because that is also a claim that's making a positive claim to knowledge. Then there's the traditional atheist view of saying God does not exist, and that's a positive claim. And then there's a view called verificationism, which is basically saying that the idea of whether basically the proposition God exists is just mumbo jumbo. It's not true or false. It means nothing. And so basically with Thomas's view, the question still arises, okay, so what is the correct definition of atheism? You're an atheist or a non-theist in the kind of way that they phrase it. So which one is it? So it's not a really useful definition. So when it comes down to it. And so usually there's a reason why atheists prefer this definition, and I think it's clear it's because it alleviates you of making a claim, which alleviates you from making a burden of, which alleviates you from basically having to come up with lots of justifications and lots of reasons for why you believe that claim to be true. Traditional atheists defend the claim, and traditional theists should defend the claim as well, and they give multiple evidences and lines of reasoning for that. And I think it's important to not shirk the responsibility of defending a claim just by redefining your words. And in a sense, there's nothing wrong with making the claim of being an atheist, being an agnostic. Sorry, I think there's just a lot of within the atheist community, it's a kind of uneasy feeling to say that I'm an agnostic, when it's perfectly acceptable to say that, you know, given on the balance of the evidence, or I'm starting off by not knowing that something doesn't exist, I'm not going to automatically rule it out, but I'm not going to automatically rule it in either. It's just I have to basically assess the evidence. There's multiple reasons people give, though, for basically this redefinition. We'll talk about a lot of these when it comes to the cross discussion. The reasons for is that, for example, I think Thomas spoke about a lot of these points. For example, we spoke about Santa Claus and the Tooth Fairy, the Loch Ness Monster, and so forth. The rejection of the claim doesn't mean you're automatically accepting the opposite claim. And he spoke a lot about the etymology of the word atheism as well, breaking down to meaning without, and theos meaning God. And then there's a couple of arguments on the other side as well. And I think we'll go a little bit more. How much time do I have? About 2 minutes. So I think we'll go into that a bit further in the discussion. We'll flesh out those a bit more because they're all interesting and all deserve to be discussed. So I think the bottom line is that this kind of debate, while very interesting, is basically the question of where should we start, and the more important question, I believe, in my personal opinion, is where we should finish. And so I think, in a sense, that this debate is not the one that we should be having first, and like Abuna said, but then we should also have the following debate, which is more important, as to what is the evidence for and against each side. And so in my perspective, I think I'd like to put forward a proposition tonight, and I think that we should define the words in a way in which how they correspond to the proposition. So the proposition tonight is going to be, for example, God exists. That is the proposition, P. And I think that a view should be defined as to how it corresponds to that proposition. So theism will be the belief that God exists is true. Atheism will be the proposition that God exists is false, and agnosticism is the view that we do not know whether or not God exists or does not exist. So I think it's fair enough to start by saying that I think in the end of the day what I'm making is a quite modest claim, in the sense that you shouldn't have to start off by either acknowledging God's, believing that God exists, or you shouldn't start off by saying God does not exist. You should kind of be open to the evidence, and I think that's more adequately characterized as agnosticism. So I think what we can all agree on is that we should have open-mindedness. We shouldn't have a predetermined conclusion before we even come to the question. And I think the default position is probably going to be agnosticism. I'll leave it at that for now.
Thank you very much, Abraam. So I think the best way to kick off the discussion is to see if anyone on my left would like to say anything to challenge that, and then you guys, if you'd like to challenge what they said, and go for it.
First off, loving the slideshow presentation. And second, we're going to start getting... we might start getting a little bit into circles here if we start just debating on the definition of atheism, which you made perfectly clear. Like, it... Keep tugging around. Excellent. So I think both parties are quite well agreed on the fact that it's difficult either way to prove that one side is absolutely correct over the other. But as you said, there are multiple definitions of atheism. It becomes a little bit hard to pin down to a single line. So that's why even in your society, in our society, the atheist group actually covers pretty much all these different belief systems. But as to coming down to atheism as a default position, it makes sense that atheism, as you said, is a combination of A, meaning not, and theism meaning belief in a God. So if we keep it down to that level, it comes not to the assertion of not believing in God, it becomes an attack against the absolute belief in something without evidence, which is an interesting point. So I'm just wondering, where do you guys see as the default position, as you said, is agnosticism, but how do we then continue on from here in this debate? So we all agree that it's hard to define anything, so should we work on an actual definition before we continue?
So, just in response to that, I think you were mentioning before, and you mentioned it as well, both panelists mentioned that the whole etymology of the word atheism, and how that's kind of a justification for why you should accept atheism as the belief of basically accepting the kind of newer, the more novel definition of atheism. I think there's just a lot of problems with that, in the sense that etymology isn't, it's kind of basically just committing like an etymological fallacy. You shouldn't derive the meanings of words based on what the historical meaning was, or based on whether the word physically breaks down to something. And I can give many examples of words that people use and have used, and how they've changed over time. And for example, literally the word doctor, for example, literally just means teacher. It's got nothing to do with, it's exactly a different entire profession. So if I'm breaking down the word and trying to use that as a justification for something else, it's not a very strong reason to believe in something. And for example, decimate, I think from decimate, the traditional, our understanding of decimate now means to destroy something, but decimate actually just meant to reduce by a portion of a tenth. In the olden times. So basically, not in the olden times, the actual meaning of the word itself, if you break down the word into certain segments in the Latin, it would mean to break it down in tenths. So I think there's multiple examples of how the physical, the etymology of the word, where it comes from and how it's broken down, can mean something entirely different. So I don't think that's a very persuasive argument to believe that atheism should be, the definition of atheism should be just disbelief or non-belief. In terms of whether or not we should define something, I think it's really important to define something before we move on, because you have to start off by meaning, you have to know that you guys are talking about the same thing and not just talking past each other. If you're operating on an entirely different understanding of what atheism means or agnosticism means, and I am, so if we've both got two entirely different definitions, then we can both be talking about entirely different things, and we're not going to get anywhere. We both kind of have to agree on what the definition is, so that kind of make the following discussion more fruitful and actually go somewhere.
Can I just chime in? One of the things that I think often goes wrong in these kinds of discussions, just hold it the right way. Thank you. One of the things that sometimes goes wrong in these discussions is it ends up being a discussion over words and what words means. And I don't think that really is a very interesting discussion. So what I'm going to suggest, what you've kind of both done is you've taken two different ways atheism can be interpreted. Theism can either be the existence of God, or theism can be that people believe in the existence of God. And I think what you guys have said is atheism is not believing in the existence of God. What you're saying is atheism is there is no God. So what I'll suggest is, rather than arguing over what atheism means, how about each of you give us a simple statement of, without using the word atheism, what you believe the default situation should be, and then let's see how close they are or if they're different, and that's what we should argue about, if that sounds reasonable.
I guess if we're just doing a quick kind of statement, my statement is already kind of summarized in the beginning, that I believe you should kind of reject a claim or withhold belief in a claim until there's evidence for the claim. I think that's fairly straightforward. To me, that's what kind of atheism is. You talked about agnosticism. My understanding of the word agnosticism, again, the etymology, Gnostic knowledge, is about whether or not you know that a God exists. And I would argue that starting from a position of agnosticism, I mean, I consider myself an agnostic. I don't know if God exists or not. I don't think that's exclusive to atheism, the belief in God. I think, they often kind of play off each other. But I find the word agnosticism even more kind of useless than the word atheist, because if we're talking about knowledge, it's kind of the case that nobody knows for certain. I think both sides agree. Nobody knows for certain if God exists or not. So that's why at the very beginning I outlined talking about beliefs rather than absolute knowledge. And in terms of beliefs, atheism, not believing, withholding belief until there's evidence, that's kind of what I stand for.
I believe that if we're going to sum this up in sort of one sentence, it'd be pretty easy to say atheism is just a lack of belief without sufficient evidence. That's all it is. And any iteration of that.
And that's where we should start.
Yeah, it's just a lack of belief without substantial or convincing evidence.
Okay. Is that different to the position you put, Abraam? Okay, how's it different?
So it's just basically it's different because of the definition. So it's just saying like...
Forget about the word atheism. Okay, put that aside. Is what they just described, you should start by suspending belief until you have evidence.
Yeah.
Is that different to what you're saying?
No, I think that's quite similar to what we're saying, and that was what I was saying before, how we have a lot of things that we agree on in the sense that you should approach a question open-mindedly, in the sense that you should approach saying, okay, X exists or X does not exist. We don't kind of automatically say X exists or doesn't until we're suspending belief until we have further information to be able to make an adequate decision. So I think we agree on that, but I think we have different titles for what we call that. Yeah.
Sorry, could you... Yeah. What I want to clarify, I think there's a slight different wording of how we say it though. So they're saying it's like this atheism. And this whole presumption of atheism was started by Antony Flew, and he kind of put this idea that there's this kind of negative atheism or weak atheism is what it's also called, which is just a lack of belief that God exists. So to clear it up, I think we've got this proposition, God exists, and someone that says, I believe in P, which is a theist, has the burden of proof then obviously of that claim. And an atheist who says, I believe not P, then has a burden of proof as well. But if you say, I do not believe P, that's kind of the negative atheism that they're claiming, there's no burden of proof because you're not making any claim. There's no proposition being made. So that's, I think, why, according to Antony Flew, we should have this presumption of atheism, this presumption of I do not believe P. But I think the main flaw with using this logic is, of course, they've forgotten another proposition, which is I do not believe not P, which is, of course, I do not believe God does not exist. And we could call this negative theism. So that's just the lack of belief of atheism. So obviously both of those at the bottom have no burden of proof, according to Antony Flew, and most philosophers would agree. Both of those do not have a burden of proof. So this doesn't really help us with determining the default position, because they're both just negations of propositions. Well, not negations in the sense that we're accepting the alternative proposition. And of course you might say, oh, you're just playing with a double negative, but of course in the question of does God exist, there are two propositions, either God exists or God does not exist. So if we just change P to God does not exist, sorry, there's a typo, there should be not, then we get the same kind of different stances. You have the strong atheism, the weak atheism, strong theism, and weak theism. And what we're saying is both of those statements, I do not believe God does not exist, or I do not believe God exists, are not very useful propositions. They don't really mean anything in terms of the question. They're just making a statement that doesn't actually increase our knowledge, doesn't help. It's not helpful in showing which part, side of the debate. So the default position is pretty much accepting both of those, that I don't believe God does not exist, I do not believe God exists, and that's why we're saying it's agnosticism. If you don't like the definition of agnosticism, what I can do is get a nice quote here from Professor of Philosophy, David Lund. He says, the truth-tracking method of effective philosophic inquiry would lead us to believe a proposition when the evidence available to us justifies our believing it, to reject a proposition when our evidence disconfirms it, and to suspend judgment about it when our evidence neither confirms nor disconfirms. So I think that's the wording is a bit different. I wouldn't say you suspend belief about the proposition, but you suspend judgment about the proposition. So I think it's a bit of a different tweaking, I guess. So.
Well, I agree with that last part, is that it would be much simpler to define atheism as a suspension of judgment rather than a belief in either direction. And based on your last argument, I'd like to propose that if we're going to say things like not P, so I do not believe in God, then we can extend that even further as I do not believe in God. And then we can just keep going further and further. So by adding, like I've done a lot of math. I've done a lot of math. And if we just keep adding negatives, eventually we're going to find ourselves back at the positive, which makes all those extra negatives meaningless. So what I'm saying is that if we can all agree, as you put there, I'd like that you put that quote there, because let's go on with that final quote saying that atheism is the suspension of judgment based on a lack of evidence. Because if we just keep arguing about the semantics of the word atheism, we're never going to get to the driving point of the debate.
But I feel like we could call that theism too, or weak theism. You can't just redefine the word as because you want it to be the default position. If we're going to suspend judgment on the issue, then why would we say that atheism is the default? Why is atheism suspending judgment on the issue?
I've got two things, if I could. The first, I don't know any weak theist. I don't know anyone who doesn't not believe. No, what is it? They believe he doesn't not exist. Are you a theist or a weak theist?
Well, I'm a theist, but I would say there are weak theists out there. Like you said, have you ever heard someone, well, I believe in God because you can't prove he doesn't exist. And that's a weak theist. He's saying there's no evidence that God doesn't exist,
but that
I do not believe the proposition that God does not exist.
But surely that person just believes he does exist. He just doesn't know for certain.
In the same way that an atheist who says, I lack belief in God, in the same way he believes that God does not exist.
Yes.
So it's the same thing.
They're not saying they believe he doesn't exist, though. They're just saying that they don't know for certain, and so they're going on the presumption that he doesn't.
And and I'm sure there are people that would not know for certain that God exists either.
But the other thing is, it says here about suspending judgment, and I would actually disagree with that, and I think that'll progress the conversation a little bit maybe, because I think it's okay to suspend judgment on inconsequential beliefs. If you tell me you have a dog in your garage, well, I kind of know dogs exist and stuff like that, so there's some evidence for it, but I could suspend judgment on that. But the God question, if true, would have to be one of the most important questions in the world. And so I think you can judge it. And if we're looking at the claim, it's a supernatural claim that's unverifiable from a book that has some contradictions, some errors and everything like that, has a lot of believers that believe in various parts of the book and disregard other parts of the book. I mean, you could cast judgment on the God character himself, whether or not you believe the character to actually exist. You could certainly cast judgment on it. And I think it's similar to Bigfoot claims or Loch Ness or Santa Claus. Like, you can cast judgment on those claims as whether or not you think they're likely, given what we know about the world, and you can apply things like Occam's razor. Is there a natural explanation that's simpler that would explain all these phenomena, like my kind of sleep paralysis and stuff like that? And we know in other religions there's been fraud, or there's been people that are deluded, or I don't know what you believe necessarily, but I assume that you reject the beliefs of other religions. So I think you can cast judgment on it, even if you don't kind of have evidence of certainty.
Yeah, and I'll agree with that. And that's another... let me just get another quote here.
Can I just say, though, I think we've kind of moved off the question of the default position now. We've got into, when you look at the evidence, what conclusion do you come to? But I think really what we want to ask today is, even before you look at the evidence, where should you be starting?
Yeah, and I think that's even Meena, I think, fell into that trap. But with that quote, like, everyone was kind of very agreeable with that quote that you were putting up before about with the Professor David Lund. But I don't think it's necessarily the same thing that we're talking about tonight, because he's saying, see, if you look before the bolded section, it says to reject a proposition when our evidence disconfirms it. So our question tonight is, before we've even assessed any evidence, where should be the default position? And so with the example of Bigfoot and Santa Claus and all these sorts of things, the question shouldn't be, oh, given the fact that we know, like there's no one at the North Pole or something like that. It's just basically, if you don't know what the concept is, say if I've told you, does Booga Jugala exist? You can't just say yes or no, he does not, or he does. I should believe that Booga Jugala doesn't exist until I have got evidence. You have to know, okay, so what is Booga Jugala? What is the characteristics that I should expect to see if Booga Jugala exists, where and what and all that, and then you kind of assess it from there. It's not, you don't just kind of disbelieve automatically, or you don't believe you don't think Booga Jugala doesn't definitely exist because you haven't, basically you have to assess the evidence, and that's what I'm just trying to say. So before we get to that question, we have to assess the evidence. And with the whole teapot and the whole Santa Claus and all these sorts of things, I think the reason that we don't believe those things is not because it's not because there's no evidence for those things. It's because we have positive evidence against those things that makes us doubt their existence. So it's not similar to the God situation, in the sense that the God situation, the atheist isn't offering positive arguments against God's existence, whereas I am offering positive arguments against Santa Claus's existence. And that's how I can be more confident that Santa doesn't exist, whereas I'm not confident that God does not exist, because there's no evidence against that so far.
Okay. So, in all this, especially with your argument using, what was it, Jugabugala? What was it, Ugabugala? What was that? It's that, let's take that for a second quite seriously. Should the foundation of our inquiry on Ugabugala be that it is wrong? Should we assume from the get-go? Because we do this a lot. We do this in almost every structured, thought-provoking scientific inquiry, any judicial system. All of it is the assumption of the claim being wrong to begin with. The big question here, and one question which I think might move this debate along, is what exempts theism from this? Why do we not assume from the get-go that that is wrong?
I don't think that's what we do all the time. And in the example of the court system, the innocent till proven guilty, it depends, of course, on two things. And Antony Flew actually uses the whole courtroom situation to explain the process that we should approach theism. But he actually acknowledges that you can't use it to support why atheism is the default position, because, of course, it depends what is on trial. What's on trial is, does God exist? And we have the proposition God exists, therefore it's innocent till proven guilty. But of course you could also have God does not exist, and then you should also apply the same thing. That is innocent until proven guilty. In other words, God exists until you prove he doesn't.
But if God existing is an idea, and it is, because remember, atheism, again, this is all depending on definitions. If we go by the definition of a non-belief, then theism is the idea being presented. It is the case. What exempts God, in your eyes, from being an idea that is up for debate?
It's not the idea. The question is, does God exist? And so there's two propositions. So if we use an example, analogy, if I flip a coin and I say it can either be heads or tails, what's the default position?
Yes. That has an answer.
Precisely. The position is not, I believe the coin is not heads. You can also say, I believe the coin is not tails. So it's not a lack of belief of heads or a lack of belief of tails. You don't know if it's heads or tails. In the same way, when you ask, does God exist? Either yes or no, or God exists or God does not exist. There's two propositions. And you can not believe either proposition, but not one of those is the default position.
True, but going back to the court case situation, in terms of guilty or innocent, there is no 50-50. In the coin toss, we know it's either because either is possible. With real evidence, one option is possible.
Yeah, again, either is possible, and again, either proposition could be on trial. So Flew is putting the proposition God exists on trial, but you could also have God does not exist on trial. The same way you could have the coin is heads on trial, and that's innocent until proven guilty. That's the proposition. So there's two propositions, and just because you've put God exists on trial and you've said it's innocent until proven guilty, you haven't looked at putting the other proposition on trial, which is God does not exist.
I don't believe the coin exists. I think a more apt analogy than the coin is if I had like a bag of M&Ms or a bag of Skittles and I pulled one out and concealed it in my hands and I asked you, is this green? What would you say?
I don't know.
Okay, so by saying I don't know, you're not professing belief that it is in fact green, even though it could be green, or it could not be green.
What I'm saying is that I don't believe that it's green, but I don't believe that it's not green.
Yeah. So I guess in terms of atheism, I would say that, yeah, I'm not saying I don't believe God exists, but given the kind of Skittles, from an atheist perspective, the thousands of available gods, I guess we'd say that it isn't green until it's kind of proven to be green. That's not to say that it's not green. It could be the case. It could be that he does exist. It's just the evidence is spurious at best, and there's a lot of possibilities. It's not a coin. It's not yes or no. It's this. It's the thousands of sects of Christianity. It's the then the countless other religions and all the religions to come, and then you've got one color.
But again, what we're trying to say is that by saying that I lack the belief in God, it's pretty much I lack the belief of any gods existing, and also you could also say I lack the belief that no gods exist. So you don't actually have to limit it down to one specific God. A lot of people will say I just believe there's something out there bigger than us, or I believe in a higher power, and so it's not a specific claim. Again, it's just a generic claim that I lack the belief that atheism is true, and I don't think there's a burden of proof associated with that. And just to kind of highlight, as you were saying, when Antony Flew kind of put his presumption of atheism, he even admitted, he said, the introduction of this new interpretation of the word atheism may appear to be a piece of perverse Humpty Dumptyism going arbitrarily against established common usage. But then he goes on to explain, of course, why he wants that. So I do feel like atheist is kind of as William Lane Craig points out, I'm not going to read the whole quote, but they're really closet agnostics who want to claim the mantle of atheism without shouldering its responsibilities. By kind of saying that I just lack a belief in God. The weak theist could do the same kind of word trickery and say I want to define theism as negative theism, where I lack the belief of no gods, God does not exist. And really that it's a meaningless statement. And it's like William Lane Craig points out, this is disingenuous and it still leaves us asking, so is there a God or not?
Jump in. Okay. We don't want to get down in what words mean. We don't want to get bogged down in what words mean. Is that all right? Can you hear me? Okay. Can I throw in just, and this will be the last thing to get you to respond to before we open the floor for questions. But I want to throw in a kind of a parallel situation. Does the world exist? Now, hang on. You jumped in quickly said yes, right? So you assumed that very, very quickly. However, if René Descartes is to be believed, you can't jump to that conclusion so quickly, because what are you basing it on? What made you think that? Okay, this is a situation where it seems that we should be applying the same kind of suspension of judgment. There is evidence, but the evidence is suspect. It's not 100% complete. And yet we all live our lives as if the world really exists, right? We all assume that, and we're all quite happy to do that. Could that be a parallel to the case of does God exist? Given that, rather than the evidence of our senses suggesting that the world exists, in this case what we have is the fact that the world exists, if it does, suggests that there has to be a reason why it exists, and therefore we should live as though there is a reason why the world exists. I don't know. What do you make of that?
So if the question is, does the world exist in terms of the Earth, I think that's, I think what you meant is reality. Yes. Yes. So the question of hard solipsism, you know, do we know anything other than our own experiences and what Rene Descartes and stuff talked about? The answer is we don't know, essentially. There's no solution to that anyone's kind of agreed upon yet. It's a presumption we all start with and go about in our everyday lives and in debates and stuff. We always presume there is a reality, a common experience between all of us and stuff like that. And it's one of the unique exceptions to the do you reject the claim. It's not an exception. I mean, you can still argue that in philosophy and stuff and kind of talk about the idea of the matrix, or are we really a brain in a vat, as one of the philosophers suggested is a possibility. But to have any kind of meaningful discussion on this conversation, we have to kind of assume there's a shared reality, and we have to assume a method of discovering truths about that reality. And so the best method, I believe, that we've come up with so far is science. It's the only method we have that reliably makes models, that reliably tests its claims and, you know, kind of self-assess and stuff. And it's not perfect, but it...
Sorry, but can I just say, science only works if the world exists.
Yes.
It could be part of the hallucination or
It could.
whatever.
Yeah, but like I said, to have any kind of meaningful discussion on anything, we kind of have to start with that presumption that the world exists. And it's kind of a...
Why can't we have that presumption for God existing?
I think we could, and some people do. I just don't see any reason why. I mean, it's essential, like I said, to have a belief in a shared reality, to have anything kind of meaningful in our lives. And I don't think you necessarily have to assume a God to explain everything there is, and I don't think you have to assume a God, as you said, for a reason why the earth is there.
For the whole argument that we can't prove anything exists because there is a statistically probable chance I'm sitting in a padded room right now, it becomes very difficult to debate almost anything. So you can debate whether or not a sandwich should cost $5 at one store because it might not exist. But the problem with assuming then that the world doesn't exist, or that I don't exist, or that anything doesn't exist, and the difference between that and the debate of God is that I can test in whatever reality I am in that the earth exists. I can test that.
Whatever test you do could be part of the simulation or the matrix or whatever.
Absolutely it could be, but to assume that anything I do could be a part of some reality that I can't perceive would be null and void to almost every action we do in our entire lives. And then this debate becomes, am I in a padded room? Answer, probably. So if we start driving everything back to, well, this is just an interpretation that I'm seeing of photons hitting my eyes, it's just my brain simulating things. For as far as I'm concerned, everyone else perceives the room as a bunch of just gas clouds instead of humans or whatever they want to be. Arguably, I am, well, you could almost say that if reality is only the perception that I'm making because we don't all exist, then technically speaking, we can end the debate by saying, I am God, because I have made this reality.
Right.
Just to chime in one more time, I think it's kind of a huge kind of shifting of the goalpost, because, you know, the question is whether or not you can prove that a God exists, and then if the theist is going to say, well, can you prove reality exists, it's kind of flipping the question on the other person. It doesn't matter whether or not I can prove reality exists. The question is whether or not you can prove God exists. I mean, that's what we're talking about. And it's a massive shifting of the burden of proof as well. You're saying that, well, you know, you don't have to prove God exists because I can't prove reality exists. It's not really relevant to the question.
Yeah, I'm about to shift the burden of proof, actually. So what we've kind of been discussing, and I agree with you guys, like, and this is from Thomas Reid, who was a Renaissance philosopher, and a lot of kind of the epistemology is built on that, like you're saying there. And he says, if there are certain principles, as I think there are, which the constitution of our nature leads us to believe, and which we are under a necessity to take for granted in the common concerns of life, without being able to give a reason for them, these are what we call the principles of common sense. and what is manifestly contrary to them is what we call absurd. So I'm going to agree with Thomas Reid on this one and have it say there's a bit of a common sense principle. Like you said, there's some assumptions like the external world exists and it's shared by all observers. Conscious minds, other conscious minds exist. The past exists. Things like that are the assumptions for us to do science, for example, are part of common sense. Building on that, I have another quote here from a book by Alvin Plantinga and Nicholas Wolfstoff, and they say, the same should be true of the Christian believer then. He should start from the belief of God rather than from the premises of some argument whose conclusion is that God exists. What is it that makes these premises a better starting point anyway? Belief in God relevantly resembles belief in the existence of the self and of the external world, and we might add belief in other minds and the past. In none of these areas do we typically have proof or arguments or need proofs or arguments. And just to kind of build on that, C.S. Lewis says, creatures are not born with desires unless satisfaction for these desires exists. A baby feels hunger, well, there is such a thing as food. A duckling wants to swim, well, there is such a thing as water. Men feel sexual desire, well, there is such a thing as sex. If I find in myself a desire which no experience in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that I was made for another world. So I think we can all agree that or I don't know, you might not agree, but so there's been studies recently as well that have found that we're predisposed to believe in the afterlife and predisposed to kind of have belief in higher powers and gods. And all of human history and cultures, there's always been this belief in the higher powers and gods. I feel like theism is actually the default position. It's our natural experience to the world. It's in the same way that we experience our natural kind of instinctual experience says there's other conscious minds, the external world exists, the past exists. We also all, as humans, are predisposed to believe God exists. And so, using the common sense principle, it should be the default position. And making a claim like atheism is the case, or a claim that God does not exist, runs contrary to our human experience and is like saying we're all, in the matrix. The burden of proof should then be on the person making the more absurd claim, as Thomas Reid points out.
If you'd like to respond, we can respond. While you're responding, if anyone has a question, could you please start to make your way up to the microphone there? Feel free to line up behind Mark there, or sit down behind him, or make yourselves comfortable in any other way so that the questions can flow. Just two requirements when you ask a question for anyone who's asking a question. One is please try to make it a question rather than like a talk. Okay, just make sure you've got very clear in your mind what you want to ask and get straight to the question. And secondly, our rule at Aletheia is that you can ask or say anything at all you like, so long as you're courteous. So please do remember to be courteous. And while we're lining up, we'll have a response.
I do think you might be right in regards to whether or not we're wired to believe. That may in fact be the case. I've seen some evidence for that and stuff like that. But the question is then whether or not how we're wired is reliable. Like I talked about, science being a reliable method of testing our experiences and stuff like that. Whereas the way we're wired isn't always reliable. As a baby, when you shut their eyes or you disappear from their field of view, they think you've disappeared, and that's not actually the case. That's not actually reality. Like, my experience with sleep paralysis was not an accurate reflection of reality. If you go to see a 3D movie, you see the things popping off the screen, that's not reality. And all of that is how we're wired, the blind spot in our vision, everything like that. But how we're wired, we know, is at least in some ways fundamentally flawed. And not every way, of course, we're fairly logical beings, but we need to test the ways we're wired in an objective way. And just seeking confirmation in the ways we're wired is not really enough, because it could be flawed.
Doesn't that prove that that's a default position until proven otherwise?
If the question is whether or not...
You just agreed with that, that's what I'm trying to say.
If the question is whether or not the biological default position is to believe in supernatural, and I wouldn't say God because there's many gods and we're wired to default belief that we see beasts in shadows and things like that. It's a survival kind of instinct. There's an argument to be made that religion was kind of culture forming and formed stronger societies and stuff like that. So if the argument were, are we wired to believe in the supernatural, I might be on your side of the table, yes, but I don't believe that's what we're here to discuss tonight, is whether or not philosophically the default position is that you believe in a God, or the default position is to not believe in a God.
Okay, we might open the floor for questions now. So our first question comes from, just state your name and go for the question.
Hi, I'm Mark. I just wanted to thank both panelists, all four panelists, both sides. For the debate. I particularly enjoy discussions like this. Also, I wanted to state that I am, for lack of a better word, a wannabe philosopher. So forgive me if I'm a little bit lost in.
They're all wannabe philosophers.
I kind of, at the start of the discussion, I kind of sensed that there was either two positions. Either the default position is atheism, or the default position is theism. And I wanted to ask, potentially, could there be two other positions, which are that the default position should be the hypothesis with the best hypothesis. Should that be the default position? And also I thought of another one, which was that there is no default position. Why can't that be a position someone can hold?
Well, if we're going to go for the position that is the best thesis, I think it was Carl Sagan who originally did a bit of a talk about this, which was what's statistically the most likely thing in the universe. And he said first and foremost that it was least likely that we're created through random elements just bashing against each other in the primordial soup of the universe. Next up was that we are created by a divine being. But all the way up the tippy top, he goes through a number of different sections, which is that we are put here by another civilization who's letting us build up resources so they can scavenge us later. But the number one most likely reason why we're here is that we are just a really, really good version of The Sims that's being played by people. Because after all, we have good enough proof that people are interested in making simulations of people because The Sims is a thing. So, in that case, then we could argue that the entire default position here should be, is that am I or am I not a computer simulation? Especially since in quantum mechanics there is a fundamental mathematical principle in it which is no different to the same algorithm that does Google searching. So therefore, we're all in a computer. Well done to us. But if we're going to put down the debate to, should we just believe that because it's the most likely thing? No, because there's a whole different plethora of things that are likely. Something being statistically most probable doesn't mean it's going to be the thing that happens. If you roll a dice and two sides are red and the rest of them are green, there's still a good chance that red is going to show up. It doesn't mean that it has to be green. And the second part.
I think asking the question of why we're here is the wrong question, because it presumes we're here for a reason at the very beginning. I think the first question should be, are we here for a reason? And then you should go from there. And I don't think it's kind of obvious. I mean, the way we're wired would have us think in this way that we must be here for a reason, but I don't necessarily see evidence for that. Or at least I'm not convinced by the evidence for that. Yeah, I think that's all I want to say on that.
Sorry, can I just clarify? I wasn't necessarily saying that the question is invalid or not important. I was just saying that there, in my head, there are two other possibilities. I mean, the default position being the best hypothesis means, for me, my default position could be theism. For someone else who has a particular, like a different knowledge. For them, their default position, well, it wouldn't be called a default position because it's different for both of us. But I mean, what I mean to say is, if you think about, for example, a child, raising a child, their set of beliefs change as they grow. And that's normal, I think. So the reason why that happens is because they accept the best explanation of the things in front of them. Why shouldn't that be the default position? Like that seems to be the most logical thing. You accept the evidence in front of you, the best possible explanation of the evidence in front of you, until it's proven otherwise.
If I could. I think the problem with the best hypothesis theory, it's not so much a problem, it's more of a niggle. I think maybe the way that some people might approach that is that you're looking for one solution to a multitude of questions. And if you have like a jigsaw puzzle and it seems like there's one empty hole, and you might be able to fill that empty hole with what kind of resembles a jigsaw piece, and it might fit perfectly. But I think the idea of God is almost like a Play-Doh puzzle piece. It can be kind of mushed out to fill the hole and explain anything for which there's no explanation. But I think that's kind of invalid because you could also use, universe-creating pixies to explain away things, or Hinduism or any other kind of religion. And I don't think it's necessarily that there is one, if the question's even valid, of why we're here, or that there is a question to even answer in the first place. But if you're looking at the hypothesis, I don't think it's necessarily one thing, and I think that might be the problem with that kind of approach, that kind of debate setting, would be the presumption of one answer.
On this.
And your actual question that that the position is an individual thing, it's fair enough. I get where you're coming from, but to say that the evidence to the individual matters is the same reason we end up with the Flat Earth Society. Because believing that, okay, what I believe alone is now valid, for that we have, for example, about 1,600 mental institutes that are filled with people who have their own interpretation of everything around us. So each one of their opinions should be equally as valid as the mass. But, we put them in a home. So the reason we do that is because having a universal agreement on something would help to move on, not because each individual person is right, but because it's just more convenient for us to have an answer, then move on with that. It's how we build every other hypothesis in science as well. We all agree on a principle, and then we can make tests based on that. But if we all agree that each of us has a different principle, we'd never have a unanimous development towards a true answer.
Okay, we'll give the gents on this side a chance before we move on to the next question.
Sure. I do agree with actually what he said, which was kind of the most plausible hypothesis. And I did have a quote which doesn't seem to be up there, but that's okay. Pretty much there's a well-known philosophical there's a view that's accepted by most philosophers, which is called the initial plausibility, and it says, if I can find it. Sorry. No, that's not it. My bad, sorry. I'll find it. Yeah. It says, in some cases to the... no. Bear with me.
While you're looking, can I
Go ahead.
just ask a question, just a response to one of the things you said, that the question of why are we here needs to be questioned itself, that is there a reason why we're here? But I think what the questioner is getting at is that in everything we see in the world around us, there's a chain of causation. A causes B, B causes C, etc. Surely that's a reasonable question to ask. How does that chain of causation begin? So that, I think that, I don't know if I'm misunderstanding the questioner, but I think that's the question he was trying to get to. Don't we need to address that question of why does anything exist at all? That's a reasonable question. That's the question of why are we here?
Well, honestly, from my point of view, as you said at the very start, I work in physics. I'd like to know why we're all here to see if I can remake that. Because why not? I could make my own universe.
All right, so it is a reasonable question to ask. It's just the bit that I wanted to sort of challenge.
Yeah, so we'd like to know because, like I said, there's a lot of things that we are researching without a real good reason why we're looking at it. So they're looking at how black holes are made, frankly, because it's cool. But the possible repercussions of learning that is that we might make gravity drives that let us fly through the solar system for little to no power. But for the time being, we're just trying to find out because we'd like to know. We're very stuck up like that. That's just from the physics point of view anyway.
I think it's a reasonable question. It's just that it starts with the presumption that there is a reason, and I think that might be...
It's not a reason in the human sense of reason. It's a reason in the sense of a cause. A logical cause.
Oh, okay, as in like a how did we get here kind of way? Yeah, I just think by saying, why are we here, it kind of assumes purpose. I think, like I said, reasonable question, it just might be worded wrong rather than a how did we get here or something which doesn't presume a sense of purpose. I just think it might be kind of a niggly way of sneaking in purpose or creation into the question, and it's a bit presumptuous to do that.
Thanks.
Sorry, I did find the quote. So this is from a kind of philosophy textbook, popular one. It says, in most cases, the initial plausibility of the claim itself determines whether the burden of proof should fall more on those who advance a claim or on those who object it. And they give an example, if the issue is whether you will die someday, then the burden is on the person who takes the negative side and says you will not, since the claim that you will not is almost implausible. And like Abraam said, that no one comes to any of these questions with a blank slate. It's so hard to kind of just assign any kind of initial plausibility, obviously. And I've got an example here where it says, there are no JEPs in the drop, and versus there are JEPs in the drop. And so obviously these are just kind of meaningless words to illustrate that we obviously kind of assign initial plausibility to either of those, and none of them seem more likely than the other. And so there's no really, it's hard to place the burden of proof. But with questions about does God exist, we all come with some pre-existing conceptions of, like you said, what God is and all of that stuff. So I agree that there is an initial plausibility, and I think that saying God exists has a lot more explanatory power, and like I said before, in terms of the common sense approach of what most people's experience is of the world, like the past exists and other minds exist, though we can't prove them, the automatic kind of human default position, and not biologically speaking, I would say, even just as our experience of the world, I guess for you that's biological, but in the same way that we say other minds exist, if you say that's a biological phenomenon, then I would say that equally so we are have a preconception that God exists.
I think just answering Mark's question, I think he was, just to reiterate his question, he was saying whether or not it's possible that the default position could be nothing, or just starting from nothing. And the problem is that I don't think that makes any sense. You have to start from somewhere. So I don't think that no default position makes much sense. Wherever you're starting from in assessing that is a default position. And the other suggestion that the best hypothesis could be the default position, it's difficult to say whether that would be a good enough default position, because you're kind of already assuming that you're kind of already assessing the evidence just by postulating kind of assessing which hypothesis would be the best place to start off with. That is already kind of, you're already kind of working towards the question. You're kind of already assessing evidences and plausibility between things. So I think in terms of this question, like does God exist or not, I don't think it has to be atheism or theism as the default position. I think in terms of my perspective, I think it's agnosticism makes most sense. And I think we've spent most of the night trying to argue for agnosticism as the default position, but then we kind of just did a little bit of a flip on the last minute there, and we just proposed the argument that theism could be the default position, actually. So that's just kind of a little sly move that we just chucked in at the back there. It was a good one. It was a good one. So Meena believes that firmly, but yes. So just that's my response to Mike's question. I think the default position would be agnosticism. I don't think no default position makes much sense, and I think assessing hypothesis is basically already going through it's not a default position because you're already starting to assess which one makes more sense, and with that you're already assessing plausibilities already in your mind.
So just to clarify, what you're saying is, for you, agnosticism, to suspend judgment or belief, is where you start. But of course you would say, when you look at the evidence from that default position, you come to the position of theism. You guys would be agreeing on the first step, that you should start by suspending belief, but you would be arguing that when you look at the evidence, you then believe that not believe, like God doesn't exist, is the more likely. Would that be a fair assessment of your positions?
Yeah, that's a fair assessment of my position. I think, but I think they would say that they would start from the position of not knowing God exists, but then they wouldn't go the next step of saying that therefore proves that therefore means that I have confidence that God does not exist, because
It's not a confident thing, but on the balance of probabilities, the evidence suggests the two positions.
We agree that a convenient default position would be that either side is wrong, but if you're looking at this in terms of an actual... So if you're going to do an analysis on theism, you must start with a hypothesis. What we're saying is that the clear starting hypothesis should be on the negative. Because then you are saying, okay, if we start by assuming... So if I go ahead and propose that I can make light turn into matter, everyone should start with, Blake, you can't. You cannot do that yet until I prove that I can.
Yeah, but my question is why? Why should we assume that you can't do that without, having some sort of, like the fact that I'm saying that you can't do that is I've already kind of made arguments against you in my mind using the laws of physics. That means I've not started the default position. The default position is you can or you cannot until I assess your evidence. So you're going to come and tell me, I can, I've got this sort of computer game that can do it or whatever. Then we're starting to assess the evidence. But I can't kind of say you don't have such power until we've started to assess the evidence. So basically my argument is that coming to this question, we already come with like background beliefs, like with that we kind of accept. And so it's difficult to like totally dismiss a claim without having to assess the claim. The claim can seem initially implausible, but that's because I've already kind of come up with a reason in my mind that it's implausible. So I've kind of assessed it and dismissed it in a very quick.
Just a quick response. I'm just conscious there's a lovely gentleman who's been waiting there for a very long time. So we'll make this the last response and we'll move on to the next question.
I think there's a reason why we start kind of with an air of negativity, if you will. The null hypothesis is a kind of principle used in statistics and looking at claims in science, and that's the presumption that the hypothesis is wrong. And we start with that hypothesis because by being skeptical, by being critical of the claim from the get-go, we're really making sure that the evidence we require is rigorous. If you go looking for evidence to confirm stuff, if you go evidence to confirm your shadowy creature was a ghost or whatever, you'll find confirming evidence, and we're prone to biases. But if you start by assuming that it's wrong and go out kind of proving that, or if you presume innocence and you ask for evidence of the guilt, you're being more critical, you're being more skeptical, you're more likely to find the truth. You're not just accepting the claim and then just moving on until you happen to bump into contrary evidence.
Sorry, but can I just point out again, we're concentrating on the proposition of God exists, but again, you should approach the proposition God does not exist with the same rigorous null hypothesis. We should assume I do not believe God does not exist in the same way I believe God does not exist. I think both, if you put the preposition God exists on trial, you should do the same with God does not exist. They're both, there's no reason to accept, treat one proposition more harshly than the other.
We should move on to the next question, and just before we do, I just want to point out that if there are no Jeps in the job, I think the boogaloo makes a lot more sense. So if you could give us your name and your question.
Hello, my name's John, and I have a question for the atheists. I'm sorry I've forgotten your names, otherwise...
Blake Thomas.
Yeah, welcome. And I just want to say, I do have a question, okay? So it might be just a little bit long-winded, but I will have a question for these fellows. Now, being Christians, we believe that God does exist. When we accept Christ as our Saviour, we receive His Spirit, we're given a guarantee, so we know. I know you don't understand that, and that's fine. God said that we only need to look at creation to see that He exists. And Christ has given us Jesus to be our Saviour, and He has forgiven us for our sin. Now, you believe that God doesn't exist. Would you consider looking for the evidence that He does?
Absolutely. Yeah, if in terms of, I'm just trying to take each point that you brought up. So in terms of just looking at creation and saying He exists, okay, that's more of a subjective, personal thing, and I completely understand that. And then, of course, Jesus dying for our sin, he died. Whether or not it was for all our sin is another question entirely. There's been many people who have died for us in history, and then we've glorified Jesus because he went through a difficult and painful death, and he was undoubtedly a great man who made many claims towards peace. So did John Lennon. So why aren't we saying that we should glorify John Lennon? So did Gandhi. Why aren't we glorifying Gandhi? But in terms of the final question is, if there was presented to us evidence that God exists, absolutely. I'd accept it if it was flawless evidence and not subjective evidence, not evidence that is up for question. If I'd put the same rigor of evidence that I put on my own work. But if God is proven to exist, then not only would I accept that is true, but I'd then probably also accept that I would, be in a bit of trouble considering I didn't have faith in the first place. So I'm ready for that. If evidence presented to me, if he stands in front of me right now, without question, I wouldn't have trouble with that.
Sorry, just before we move on, just actually, can you elaborate on the last point? What kind of evidence would it take for you, to prove it? And after that, after both of you have finished, maybe we can ask the gentleman on this side, what kind of evidence would it take to convince you that God doesn't exist?
Well, if we're going to go for the absolute definite evidence, it would be, there he is, hello, pleasure to meet you. But if we're going to start downscaling the evidence to the point that I would start to believe an absolutely unexplainable event that directly relates to the subject of God. So just saying that a meteorite fell down and suddenly stopped and then was sucked back into space, fantastic. God could have done that, but so could a spaceship in theory. I mean, we'd have to start looking at what could a God do that no other being in any conceivable version of the universe could. And you have something to add?
So very much the same. I would believe if there was evidence. Just quickly to go over your thing about looking at creation, I don't really find that very convincing because we've got the theory of evolution and such, and they would argue that looking at valleys, looking at clouds and stuff is kind of evidence of water, and clear skies is safety, and so we're bound to feel good about those kind of things. And and it's as much evidence for Buddha and all the other religions as well, as far as I'm concerned. In terms of what kind of evidence I would need, as Blake said, kind of hinted at, it would have to be something quite extreme. I wouldn't believe my own vision if I saw it, especially if it was me in a room alone, because I've experienced things which I know weren't true, or I suspect weren't true, and I know that we have flaws in the way we're wired and such. But it would need to be some kind of testable evidence at the very least. Like I said, with the teapot and such, like one of the problems with the God claim is it's untestable, it's unrepeatable. But all of that aside, if the claim is true about God as described in the Bible and such, I mean, he would know what evidence it takes, and yet here I remain unconvinced. So
Yes, I can understand that. If you don't believe, you don't believe. I've always believed in God, and I didn't have a doubt that God existed, but it wasn't until I accepted Christ as my saviour that I was given a guarantee. And so I suppose my question to you is that, well, we know what the question is, but unless you really want to look and call out to God, I suppose nothing really is going to happen. That's where it's coming from.
I would say that I have...
We've moved away from the original thing, but when I first
That's fine.
had a look at atheism, is that the default? I was looking at... just give me 1 second to get my thoughts here.
If I could, with what you've already started with, and then maybe you can get to the next point.
The thing is that I've got to go back to the Bible, and I believe what the Bible says is true. And that in the Bible, from Adam and Eve, and then through, from them, they believed in God. Right, Noah believed in God. So that was the default then. It wasn't atheism. It started from God. So to have atheism being the default, in the eyes of a Christian, it can't be. So that's that's the argument that I have. I know it doesn't stand up for someone that doesn't believe, I understand, but my original question was, would you consider looking for God? And really, we need to call out to him, because if we just go on our own way, we will not find God. You know what I mean? We need to search for him, call out to him. And my apologies, because I know
that's okay.
you said even
That's great.
last time you didn't want a sermon. I know I'm heading down that road.
That's okay. No, it's great.
But I've got to sort of put the point of view across. You know, we can argue back and forth.
That's fine.
Philosophically.
Yeah. Like we
We're
said,
never
you
gonna
can
get
say anything
anywhere
you
here,
like
so
here,
go.
and you were very courteous as well. So, can I actually generalise your question a little bit more? Historically, lack of belief in God or gods is actually incredibly rare. When you look at most societies through most of human history, it's only a very modern phenomenon for a very small part of human history. So I wonder, and we're still going to come back and ask you guys, by the way, about what would convince you that God doesn't exist. But how about we give you guys some time to think about that one while we ask these guys and finish that question off, and then we'll come back to that more general question over this side.
And if I could just
We'll just get them to respond, and then you can ask after we finish. Yes, just so we finish the questions, and then we move on to the next thing.
So what was the question again?
What evidence would it take for you to stop believing in God, I suppose?
I think for me it would be if someone could just show that the idea of God just doesn't make any sense, that it's like logically incoherent. I think that's the main thing, because I think the idea of God's been studied really well, and it's been really formulated really well to very coherent to my satisfaction. So I think, and basically maybe to show, I don't know, some sort of historical evidence that Jesus didn't exist, or didn't exist, or wasn't crucified. Maybe that would be, something that would be cause me to basically reassess a lot of things. Yeah.
Okay. And just before we go on, I'm in the question of before. Sorry, I forgot. Thomas was saying that it's kind of not falsifiable. The belief in God is not falsifiable. You are ways in which it is falsifiable.
Yeah, and I think Thomas has said a lot of things about epistemology tonight that I disagree with, but I just haven't had the chance to bring it up. But I think I find this as well typical of many atheist people, that they kind of put way too much way too much more confidence in science than they do to even like more things that might be more rigorous, the things like mathematical and logical truths, and things that are like your properly basic beliefs, with things like perception and things like that. They put science, like the kind of scientific truths, to be way more reliable than those. But I think science doesn't even begin to work unless you kind of assume so many things, all of which are those type of things, those mathematical, logical truths, perceptual beliefs, assumptions about speeds of light and so forth. Then you kind of build from those assumptions. You try to discover laws, and you discover patterns, and you try to repeat them. So I think it's kind of on the hierarchy of evidence of things that we should believe and things that we shouldn't believe. I think you kind of have to start from the foundational beliefs of like what you can see, experience, and then you can kind of go from logical and mathematical truths, and then you go from there into building, like science and evidential truths are kind of like tertiary kind of levels of evidence, and then maybe testimony and things like that come a little bit later. So I think it's just in terms of and requiring certainty and requiring things is quite difficult. Obviously, there's a lot of things that we don't know with certainty, but I think there's enough probability that we can make, rational decisions and judgments on a day-to-day life. Yeah.
Sorry, just quickly. To not believe in God, I think it would be very difficult because, like I said, I think it does it'd be like asking, what would it take for you not to believe that other minds exist? I think it's a very difficult question. It's just so close to, well, personally, my human experience that there is a God. To not believe maybe in the Christian God, like Jesus Christ as God, I think it would probably be some sort of, like Abraam said, historical evidence that, the whole thing was a sham, or, it's all lies about, the life of Jesus and things like that, that revelation of who God is. That's about it.
Okay, thanks for that. So just before we'll go on to the question of historically, atheism was quite unusual, so does that have any impact on whether it should be the default position or not? After that, we'll give you one more question, if that's okay, because I do notice there's another chap standing behind you as well.
Just to comment on...
after we get the response, and then...
I've got a lot to respond to. I'll just go back to your previous thing about going looking for God. I think I have, like I said, I went to an Anglican high school, I went to a Christian youth group, I was christened. I haven't done all those same things with Islam or Buddhism, I've looked at those kind of books after the fact. I've read through the Bible as well, twice actually. So I think I've given Christianity like a fair go, really. And I think it would be kind of devoting my whole life in this search for religion, and if I spent my whole life looking in Christianity, I might become convinced, but I don't think that's fair when I'm not doing that with every religion, and I think, that everyone should try and, give all the claims some kind of chance to, like I said before, if you go looking to confirm your belief, I think you will. In terms of atheism being kind of very small historically, I agree. We did kind of look for lots of explanations for things in the past. Bloodletting was also quite popular in the past as well. Popularity doesn't necessarily make for truth. Recently we had a census actually, and non-belief is up around 30%. In Australia, so the number one category, if you kind of split Christianity down into the various sects. But I think that in general, religiosity has shrunk with the more information we found about the natural, the more explanations we have that are more kind of rational based. And I think similarly, you can look at countries today and look at the education systems of various countries, and with America being an exception, the least religious countries are the most educated countries. It seems to me that God was an explanation for things, a lot of things in the past, and he's becoming less and less relevant in terms of those explanations. Still very useful in terms of building societies and stuff though, religion at least anyway. So, one more. You said that if somebody could prove that Jesus didn't exist, that would kind of disprove it for you. A lot of people with Julius Caesar, he was claimed after the fact to have been a god and such, and I don't believe that Caesar didn't exist, but I don't believe that he was a god. I think the historical question of whether or not Jesus was a character is kind of irrelevant to whether or not the claims of Christianity are true. I believe that Jesus was very likely a character in history, but some of the claims I'm dubious of, as I am with Caesar, as I am with Muhammad, etc.
Yeah, but you're not arguing that because those countries, because the secular countries are more intelligent, that therefore God doesn't exist, or that you're saying that that's a reason that for atheism. That's just a general kind of human observation. What's the conclusion that you're trying to draw from that fact?
I'm just observing that the more kind of natural explanations we seem to have for things, the less my interpretation of that would be, and it's not conclusive, I'm just saying there's this idea of the God of the gaps argument that, God must exist because we have no explanation for why we're here, but before, God must exist because who put the light in the sky? God must exist because, there was loads of questions we didn't have the answer to, and that was used as a case for why God exists, and there's less and less of those cases available, the more natural explanations we have. And as we progress scientifically, as we get more objective evidence, people in general become less religious. And I think that's because they're relying on God as an answer less. And one of you did say about God having explanatory power, and I believe he does have explanatory power. He has near infinite explanatory power in the same way that, the pixies that, hide my socks from the washing machine have explanatory power, and that's why I always have odd socks. You can make up any number of kind of claims that have explanatory power, universe-creating pixies I mentioned earlier, but just because it has explanatory power, I don't believe that lends credence to it. It's that idea of the puzzle piece I mentioned earlier that can be kind of pushed out to fill anything. It can be used as an explanation for anything, but the more and more natural explanations we have, the less and less powerful that thing becomes, the less and less people rely on it.
Yeah, so my question was, what's the conclusion that you're trying to, that's an observation that you've made, and I don't have any objections with that observation. So what's the conclusion from that observation?
Just that historically God has been used as an explanation for natural phenomena.
Yeah, that's the conclusion, is it?
Yes, like I said, it's not kind of...
Okay. Yeah,
there would be a whole case to kind of build there, but
yeah.
that was just one little anecdote as to why I believe that, religiosity was popular in the past and is becoming less popular.
So just in response, so with the whole shift of how the proposal of theism being the default position, given the fact that the majority of people in history have a tendency to believe in divinity and supernatural entities, what's your response to that being a good reason why theism should be the default position, and then we kind of go from there?
Sorry, I missed that last bit.
So basically, I think what Meena was kind of arguing before is that theism. This is not something that I believe. I'm just saying that this is something possible. This is what Meena was saying. Maybe Meena should make this argument.
Yeah, I think it's less to do with explaining natural phenomena and more about life after death, believing that we're, some sort of us continues. There's a lot of, I think, intuitive reasons why humans believe in God rather than, how do we explain this? Oh, God done it, and then, finding out that it's not true. I think people are religious not just to explain things, but it's a intuitive thing that people, feel. And of course, you can argue it's all psychological, but I think what I'm trying to say is in the same way that we have an intuition that other minds exist and the past exists, that there's an external world that exists that's shared by all of, all these observers, in the same way that those are all kind of instinctually obvious to us, then they should be kind of counted as common sense approaches, and that's why theism is a default position.
Yeah, I think there's kind of a lot of things that we believe intuitively is the problem. Like we drilled into our heads when we used to get headaches and stuff because intuitively that would relieve the pain. A lot of people did bloodletting. There's beliefs of Bigfoot, Sasquatch, what do they call them up north? Yeti. There's loads of intuitive beliefs, the old hag syndrome. But what I was saying before about science and stuff is we have to rigorously test those intuitions because again and again we found them to be not true.
Yeah, but so the default position.
So we might have to. We might actually have to skip. Your questions have raised a lot of issues and a lot of really good discussion, which I thank you for. But we've only got a few minutes left, and there is one more questioner. So do you mind if we move on to the next chapter? And after we finish, hopefully the guys will be hanging around for a while. Feel free to continue the discussion. But we just want to. Peter's been waiting for a while. Then don't want him to miss out.
Hi, I'm Peter.
Hello, Peter.
Sorry, I'm a bit of a simpleton, so I'm just going to assume that, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, that we've come to the conclusion that the default position should be the most neutral one, which is I don't know. Is that correct at this point?
It's an interesting question.
Yeah, no.
Probably. Back to the very beginning, I think the initial points brought up was that the most neutral position and the one from which you should probably walk away thinking is that agnosticism or the null belief, as in I don't care either way, could be a very valid starting position. But the debate has sort of come down to, we're saying that the null hypothesis, that is to have any reasonable thought process on the subject, you should start with the negative to move on to a positive, or to remain at the negative, should continue. And this group over here is saying that the default position to move on with in your life is that either side, I could be right or wrong on this, is that either side could be right, and it's up to the individual to come to the conclusion of what they believe to be true.
Okay, so just before you respond, starting from negative, from my understanding, it seems to me like what Abraam said is an evaluation has been already made. So you've made an evaluation based on some kind of evidence because you've gone from one side to the other. So it's not neutral, but there's an evaluation made. So it's not neutral. When, the gentleman on your left, mentioned that they use a null hypothesis in science. I think there's a bit of, the reasoning behind that is because it's harder to prove something. It's a good starting point because once you've moved away from the null, you've definitely proved something. You've made evidence. But in a situation where it's not trying to prove something new, it's just trying to evaluate a situation from a standstill, that you don't need to start from making it harder.
Yeah.
You just start from the most default position. So can you explain to me why you want to add that extra level of difficulty, say, for lack of a better word, in regards to this subject?
Well, I can tell you immediately the reason that we do that in science is actually pretty concrete. It's because by assuming a truth and working towards the truth, you are likely to find that truth. But that does not actually... So you can find evidence that points towards... Say if I drew 5 points in the sky, I said, by all the evidence here, I have a pentagon. And someone else can turn around and say, no, you have a star. But by the null hypothesis is by saying that, okay, I'm wrong. And
well,
therefore...
what you just said is assuming a truth. I didn't say assuming a truth. I said starting from zero. Not null, not positive.
Yes.
So why do we make it not null? So why do you want to go to the null with this subject? Because in science, there's a burden of proof because of those. Well, like you said, it's just. I'm not going to repeat. Yeah, there's a burden of proof to go away from the null. But in this situation, why do you want to put that extra burden of proof in the situation?
Because the only way to know that something is absolutely correct in any instance is to know that every other possibility is wrong.
Okay.
That's why we have things like... That's sort of the difference between a theory in science and a law. A theory is just something that's been consecutively proven over and over again to be right.
Right.
But it's only created into a scientific law because literally every other option has been explored and proven wrong.
Okay.
That's the reason why they're so rare.
So that's why we start from the null instead
Yeah,
of
yeah.
starting from a completely neutral position.
Exactly. Like take, for example, quantum mechanics. Now, if we're going to do any argument into why the instinct should not be true, quantum mechanics is probably the best I can think of, given that it basically states the entire universe is random in whatever degree or possibility. And the reason why we aren't saying that that is true is because that theory was only thought of, I guess, really actually thought of about 50, 60 years ago, and started to do experimental work on 50. The 50 years isn't enough to prove that any answer is right. We need thousands of years of rigorous testing to prove anything is absolute in any way. We didn't even use the term law anymore in science because it's just too absolute. And therefore, by saying that, the only reason we're saying atheism is the default position is because you should start with the assumption that your idea, the idea you're bringing forward, the idea of God, needs every other plausible solution needs to be proven wrong before that is right.
Okay, cool.
Thank you very much. Okay, we're drawing towards the end of the night. To finish off the discussion part of the night, can I ask both sides a question? What do you think you have agreed upon tonight? And what do you think you have disagreed upon tonight? And we only have like 5 minutes, so like 2 minutes each, if we could. Yeah.
I'll try and make it really quick then. I think we both agree, it seemed at least, that agnosticism should be kind of a neutral position. And then we both kind of veered slightly one way or the other, depending on our kind of tendencies. So agnosticism being that we don't know. I think everyone at the table would agree that we don't know. And then the question becomes whether or not you should kind of have a presumption or leaning towards truth or a leaning towards false. And I would always err on the side of skepticism. It provides the best results. I mean, scientifically, that's what we do. In the courtroom, that's what we do. The null hypothesis, that's what we do. We put our claims to the test. And in putting them to the test, we're kind of assuming them to be false until they really hold up to the rigorous evidence. And that's why I kind of lean towards the this isn't true, and then kind of go out of my way to try and prove that it is true or not true.
I think the one thing we've agreed on most of all is absolutes are absolutely forbidden. Either way, we can't say that we absolutely know that one is wrong or one is correct. And so moving on from that, the debate comes down to which one should you start with. Done. That was it. Fine.
So I'd like to reiterate by saying that, again, there's two propositions to look at. So if you're going to be skeptical of one, being the proposition God exists, you should be equally skeptical of the other, being God does not exist. So having a not believing either proposition, I wasn't saying that you can pick and choose. What I was saying was they were both meaningless. Saying I do not believe God exists and saying I do not believe God does not exist are not default positions. They're just both rejecting two propositions, and the default should be not suspending judgment on either of those. So not saying you don't believe in God, not saying I do believe in God, just complete suspension. But having said that, that's on a completely blank slate, and I think initial plausibility should apply and common sense should apply, like I mentioned before, and that the same way that we have certain default positions when it comes to things like external minds, the past, assumptions of science like the external world exists, that belief in God is part of those default positions. And just on the analogy on, innocent till proven guilty, I'll just, okay, I'm done.
So I think the things that we kind of agreed on was that I think like a type of suspension of belief is the default position. We don't believe that something exists or does not exist until we kind of assess the evidence. Although our friends on this side are kind of leaning more towards the skeptical thing that we should kind of assume that it doesn't exist until proven otherwise, but they're not saying that that assumption that it doesn't exist is equivalent to saying that it does not exist. And I think that the null hypothesis and all that is a kind of like a methodological consideration in science, just to kind of see whether two events and things are correlated, or one is caused by another. It's not a constraint that we need to have in terms of like a philosophical argument or something that we need to assess. If we're just trying to assess, look, we don't put that kind of burden of proof on ourselves on day-to-day things that we think are true. Like, I don't need to rule out every possibility that this is my phone that's sitting right in front of me before I accept that to be true. I see my phone's there and I immediately accept that it's true. I don't need to rule out all the possible ideas that it could be an illusion or I could be on drugs or anything like that. So I think in this sort of instance, it's an example of how we put much higher burdens of proof on things that on the question of God's existence. And I think there's like an element of like behind it where if it's because of the importance of the question, we need like 10 times stronger evidence to accept it, when we should just apply rational arguments and evidence for it and accept it on the same sort of level that we accept other things. The thing that one of the surprising things actually from this that one of the things that we didn't agree on, especially I think between Meena and the other side of the group, which I was very surprised on, was the argument that theism could be the default position. And I think Meena gave a very strong argument from the historical perspective that human beings in general are naturally inclined to believe in God. And human beings throughout all generations, the majority of people have believed in God. And people, like, there's almost to the argument that if you take someone and put him in an island somewhere and raise them up by, like, you know, if monkeys raised someone, the person would naturally come to the conclusion that God exists. So and that's a kind of strong argument for thinking that theism is the default position, which I didn't think that would be a case tonight. But we really didn't hear very much in terms of response to that. The response that we heard was, well, our instincts are wrong, and we know from science and things that we can kind of disprove the instinct. But that's the whole point. The default position, without doing all of that extra work, was that God exists. So that's a very surprising conclusion from tonight, I think.
Well, thank you all. Of course, just to clarify, in talking about the default position today, we're not talking about the conclusion that we come to. We're talking about where we start from. And of course, to reach a conclusion, we'd have to talk about many other things, which we hope we will continue to do through the year in further meetings of Aletheia, as we have done over the past years. So I'd like to thank all our panellists, Blake and Thomas and Meena and Abraam. Can we please give them our warm thanks for a fascinating discussion today? And I'd particularly like to thank you and commend you all for the lovely spirit in which it was conducted, and for I learned a lot tonight, actually. I thought about things that I hadn't thought about before, and I hope that it's helped you guys also to think about things you haven't thought about before and to develop your own understanding and knowledge of the topic. Our next Aletheia meeting before we close is actually going to be next week. And it's going to be back at St. Damiana's Church in Punchbowl. So it's Sunday, the 16th of July, and we're going to be going kind of in-house this time. We have Dr. Ray Williamson, who is an Anglican, I know he's an Anglican minister. I'm not sure if he's a theologian or what his other background is. He was very involved in the ecumenical movement for a while. I think he was the secretary or president of the National Council of Churches and things like that. So he's going to be coming and talking to us about the Protestant Reformation. So we're going to be diving into the differences between Protestantism and Orthodox Christianity, looking at the historical reasons for that, and looking again at where do Orthodox and Protestant Christians agree and where do they disagree, and trying to understand those things a little bit better. So that's next Sunday, 6 p.m. as usual, St. Damiana's at Punchbowl. Two other messages for you. One is that lots of people are keen to have a chat. Oh yes, I also should say we welcome and say a big thank you to groups from the Sydney Atheists and the Western Sydney Freethinkers who joined us tonight. And I don't know if there are any other atheist groups. I don't know if the UTS and Macquarie people came in numbers, or do you see any faces you recognise out there? One or two? Oh, okay. So thank you very much for coming. We hope you enjoyed the night, and we welcome you very warmly. And also those from other Christian churches and other Christian denominations. We're very happy that you were able to join us tonight. It really enriches our discussions together, and those discussions may be continued after we finish over some lovely, nutritious and healthy snacks which will be provided outside. I think you just go outside and out the doors and you'll find a table with some snacks. Feel free to hang around, continue some of the discussions. The questioners today raised some very interesting ideas and topics that you might want to pursue. These guys will be hanging around for a little while, so if you want to grab them and pull their ears off with your questions, I'm sure they'll be more than happy to do that. So we look forward to seeing you next week. And we'll conclude, as we usually do, with the Lord's Prayer. If we can all please be upstanding. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, one God, Amen. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Through Jesus Christ our Lord, for thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory forever and ever. Amen.